Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, potentially, or good evening, where you might be listening from. Welcome to the first Adobe Creative Campus Digital Literacy Cafe of 2023. We are thrilled that you're here with us. This 1 hour webinar is being recorded, and there is a transcript being made. If you would like to ask questions, and we certainly want to have a conversation towards the end of the hour with our guests and panelists, please use the Q&A pod to do that. I'd like to begin by taking a quick poll and seeing what everyone is thinking about in terms of our conversation today. And so the first poll we're gonna ask is, and I'm launching it now, is how concerned are you that the advent of ChatGPT and other artificial intelligence technology will negatively disrupt teaching and learning? And so let's just take a quick sense of what's going on here. And if I'm honest, I've spent a lot of the last 2 or 3 weeks reading about this, and I'm nowhere near an expert, which is why I called a couple of people, Sid Dobrin from the University of Florida and Stacey Cochran from the University of Arizona, to help me think through these issues. I see that already there's a fairly even distribution of responses to this, and I'm glad we're recording this, because I get the sense that even 6 months from now, but definitely 6 years from now, we all may want to look back on this recording, and I don't know if we'll be laughing, but we'll be probably shocked at how early our experiences are, how naive, at least speaking for myself, we might be at this moment. And so that makes me even that much more grateful to our guests who are coming together to help us think through these things. And so this series, the Adobe Creative Campus Digital Literacy Cafe, is a really enjoyable experience for me as the host. I get to sit down and pick the brains and chat with the cool kids, some of my favorite people that I know in higher education. And so I'm really grateful to have Sid and Stacey with us. I'm going to ask our two guests to introduce themselves in just a second, and just kind of quickly give people a background of who they are and what they do. And then we're gonna dive into 5 questions that are going to organize everything today. So my name is Todd Taylor. Like all of us in higher education, I'm wearing way too many hats these days. My business card for Adobe has the title of pedagogical evangelist, and I'm also an English professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where I used to direct the first year writing program. And like our other 2 panelists today, I also have kind of an avocation. In case of my co-panel, my guest today, not exactly an avocation, but in my case, an avocation with painting, with visual arts, with music, with creating and constructing. And so those have been a part of how I approach my vocation of the teaching of writing, and that informs this bigger conversation about creativity in general. But today we're definitely focusing on writing in the context of higher education. So Sid, if you let the folks know who you are and what you're up to.
Sure. Thanks, Todd. Hi, I'm Sid Dobrin. I am chair of the Department of English at the University of Florida. I also am the founding director of the Trace Innovation Initiative, which is an emerging technology research hub. I also serve as a faculty member with the Florida Institute of National Security, which is part of the University of Florida's AI initiative. Those are my official academic titles. I am also host of the Fishing Professor Rodcast, and I also do a lot of film production and, as Todd said, visual art things. So my interest here extends well beyond the academic into various aspects of other professional worlds.
Stacey.
Yeah, I'm just grateful to be here. My name is Stacey Cochran. I'm an associate professor at the University of Arizona. I've taught writing for 25 years. This year, I actually have a dual appointment in English, and half my workload is actually over in the College of Fine Arts in the School of Theater, Film, and Television. And so I really do wear both hats, both as a writing instructor and thinking about the visual arts as well. So yeah, in my downtime, I'm doing a lot of stuff collaboratively with film in Southern Arizona. And I guess the biggest news is I had a novel that was published in 2015, was made into a film starring Gabriel Luna and Joanna Vanderham. So yeah, I've had a long time to think about how we might use technologies like this to our advantage. My research interests are specifically how we can use writing to support students' well-being. And so when we think about ChatGPT, I'm already thinking about how can we use this to support our social and emotional health, and what are some of the drawbacks potentially as well.
Awesome. Thank you. And so we're going to dive right into 5 questions that are going to organize what we're looking at today. Each of us is going to kind of do a brief sort of history or philosophy of technology, especially as it impacts the teaching of writing, because that's the biggest concern right at this moment. There are lots of implications for gen tech and artificial intelligence for all kinds of areas of, inside and outside of the academy. But at the moment, there's obviously great concern about how writing as something that almost, essentially defines the college experience is now being challenged because of concerns about integrity and what it means to create and write. And so we'll begin with just kind of a individual, glance back at histories of writing technologies that have changed the way you look at things, and then we're gonna think about Gen Tech and Chat GPT in a positive light, and then we're going to be skeptical about its influence, and then we're going to zoom out and we're going to consider the implications for creativity and what it means to be a human in terms of creative abilities at large. And then lastly, we're going to close with some practical takeaways, some pieces of advice, some best practices that we recommend emerging from our conversation. And I want to take as a provocative opening quote this from an article that was published just a couple days ago in the Wall Street Journal, authored by Henry Kissinger, yes, the Henry Kissinger, Eric Schmidt, and Daniel Huttenlocher. The title of the piece is Chat GPT Heralds an Intellectual Revolution. And the subtitle or the tagline for this piece is Generative Artificial Intelligence presents a philosophical and practical challenge on a scale not experienced since the start of the Enlightenment. And that's a very big claim, that this is, something like a Copernican revolution that's bigger than any of the other technologically driven transformations that we've seen in our economies and cultures, but especially in education. And so they are the folks who wrote this opinion piece are staking a claim that this is a huge deal. They write the technology is known as general artificial intelligence. GPT stands for generative pre-trained transformer. ChatGPT, developed at the OpenAI research laboratory, is able to converse with humans, and that's a claim that I want to consider. Is it really conversing with humans? As its capacities become broader, and here's the big claim, they will redefine human knowledge, accelerate changes in the fabric of our reality, and reorganize politics and society. And so that's an enormous claim. And there are lots of different ways to get into this, but I'd like for each of us to begin with at least one example or snapshot of our experiences as folks who've been at the forefront of writing instruction in higher education. Each of us has authored textbooks on the subject and been teaching for over 20 years in the area. At various times had different roles in terms of writing program administration. And so I want to begin by trying to make an analogy or an analog between a previous technology and this one. And in my case, I remember the day that I saw HTML in a web browser for the first time. I can still see that moment dramatically. I was interested in interactive writing, writing on networks. This would have been 94, I think 1994, where I was in graduate school at the University of South Florida with Sid Dobrin at the time. And I thought, wow, this, and I remember saying to the person who showed it to me, everyone in the world who has this browser and connected to the internet can see this right now. And so to me, HTML, which if you're a nerd about these things, is emerged from something called SGML, Standard Generalizable Markup Language, is a technology combined with the killer app of the web browser that has done all the things that Kissinger and company just claimed. And so I have been working with how literacy has been evolving in response to these technologies since the early 90s. And I haven't come to terms completely with the advent of HTML and the web browser, but my experience teaches me or suggests that right now we really have almost very little idea what this is going to mean in 5 years. Because, if you think about it now, most people aren't even talking about hypertext anymore the way they were in the early 90s, because it's just become so ubiquitous and baked into everything we do. And I think we're going to eventually get to that point with AI technologies. But at this moment, we are in such the infancy state that I feel like I need years of this kind of conversation before we have a real handle on what it is and what to do about it. So that's my sort of historical starting point and analog. Sid, where would you like to begin in terms of thinking about histories of writing technologies in terms of better understanding this particular moment we're in today?
God, what you said was so rich and so full of things I want to comment on. I remember when we started talking about HTML way back then. I do also want to remind you that when you and I both started coding, you gave a talk about HTML, and as an example of bad coding, put up web pages I had been designing as your example of how not to do HTML. But
Some things never change.
yeah. But what you're talking about in terms of how we think about technology and literacy has been at the forefront of how I've been thinking about things for a very long time. And we can take it back to that notion that Greg Ulmer and others talk about in terms of the ways that culture and the idea of the human so drastically changed when we shift from orality into literacy, and what the advent of writing did for us as human beings. Well, we're seeing now that shift into something very different than literacy as well, what Ulmer had called electracy. And to me, that's the intriguing long-term question. What is this going to do for what we are as humans and our cultures and our societies and how we function? I should point out too that article that you mentioned by Kissinger, Schmidt, and the others is actually taken from a book they published called The Age of AI and Our Human Future. And they've been working on this for a couple of years now. But, you asked the question about what was the moment for me. And I think that it was when I first started working with augmented reality and using AR programming and coding to first recognize that our conception of writing is no longer just alphabetic, that it is multimodal, that the image and the moving image are as important to written communication as the alphabetic are. And that ability with AR to create this concept of layering, to move writing into location-specific media, that to me shifted my entire approach to how do I think about writing. The concept of topos and the concept of locating writing in particular places, and then being able to actually put that writing in particular places, just drastically changed for me what writing is. Writing was no longer about starting at the top of a page and writing a paragraph and then another paragraph. It was more about a more holistic, encompassing concept of communication.
All right, Stacey, how about you?
Yeah, the immediate thought that comes to mind, I've just come off of putting under contract a new novel, and it took 8 years to write. And the software that I was using to write this novel does something I'm sure everybody in the audience can relate to. As I'm writing a sentence, it'll offer suggestions for how to end that sentence, right? And so as any day that I'm sitting down to actually do some writing on a given chapter over that 8-year period, I have suggestions coming to me from this program immediately about how to finish a sentence that are different than perhaps my frame of reference would even suggest. My lived experience might have me thinking about how to finish a sentence a different way. I think we can all relate to that with email suggestions and maybe some of the suggestions that are offered, especially in email conversation. Actually, for me anyways, as someone who grew up in an enormously dysfunctional household as a child, some of those suggestions in email are quite useful and helpful in terms of cordiality and politeness and really civil discourse. So I look at this technology as an optimist, and I see the potential benefit for someone who struggles with language, for someone who struggles with social interaction. I mean, think about kids who, for example, my son who has autism, has trouble interacting with others. This is a technology that can offer really mighty rhetorical strategies to think about interacting with someone else. You could plug in an email that you received from somebody and say, how should I respond to this thing? Especially if it's really complicated. So I look at it as this kind of technology that has been evolving for a long time. I imagine, when people were beginning to write on the computer, people thought, well, this is different than writing on a typewriter. When people were writing on a typewriter, this is different than handwriting, right? When filmmaking first began, people that were in theater were saying, what is this new technology? It's so crass and cheap. We shouldn't be endorsing it or what have you. So it's interesting to me, every new technology, I think there's always going to be some sort of resistance to it, right? Or questions about it. I think that's healthy and natural. But in my view, fear should never sort of predominate our discussions about an emerging and new technology. Yeah.
Awesome. And so I'm ending the poll, and I think what you were just saying, especially Stacey and Sid, is what our audience is reflecting. I mean, almost a third of folks, the most predominant answers, we just don't know enough yet, and that's what we're here today, gathering together to do, to work together as a community, as a network, to try to figure these things out. And history has taught us to have a kind of patience, but there's an interesting comment in the Q&A pod that says we don't have time to figure this out. We've got the reality of courses that we're going to be teaching in Monday morning, or at least next fall, where we need to start coming to terms with these things. And so that's a good point. And as we move the discussion forward, you've already started talking about some of the potential affordances or advantages of these technologies entering the space of mainstream college writing. And I'd like to make a reference to one of my favorite scholars in this area. And he was writing about hypertext at the time. His name is John Dan Johnson Ilola. And he wrote that, when these new technologies come out, his experience, and this made a lot of sense to me, is a combination of euphoria and vertigo, because things are being reorganized, because the fabric of reality or our political structures are going to be reshuffled. It's disorienting, but it's also potentially exhilarating. So let's explore the affordances first. Let's put on our sort of our lenses through which, as Stacey just pointed out, in terms of folks with neurodiversity, this may be a huge advantage. So Sid, if you were going to play the believing game as a place to start, what possibilities and affordances are you excited about?
Well, I think the first place I would start with that is it really opens up the conversation about, or a disruption of the conversation about how we have universalized writing students, about how we have talked about students as all needing the same kind of thing, and that, we've trained them and prepared them for a specific kind of writing. And I think that what generative AI is showing us is that there are other ways to think about how we think about our students, that they aren't all here to learn how to write the essay, that there are other forms and contents that they're going to have to engage. And I mean, honestly, for me, the euphoric part about this is the disruptive capabilities, that this is going to make us think differently about stuff. And as Stacey was alluding to, there's not a moment in writing's history that the invention or the introduction of a new writing technology hasn't been met with just massive sorts of resistance. I mean, the example I keep giving when I give these talks and these seminars is, think back not very long ago about the same exact kind of response we're seeing to ChatGPT that we saw to Wikipedia. And, we've got to ban this from campuses and students won't do real work anymore. Well, Wikipedia is now ubiquitous, and our writing assignments have students writing wiki pages or critiquing wiki pages or editing wiki pages. And, what we have to recognize, and what Stacey was getting at, is all technology, not just writing technology, I mean every bit of technology, has two pathways. It either becomes obsolete or it becomes naturalized into the background of how we do things. And the example I give with that is, nobody sits down at their dinner table and looks at their spoon and goes, oh my God, what a fascinating piece of technology. Because we've made it so ubiquitous and so naturalized into our background, we tend to forget that the spoon had massive effects on human culture, on public health, on social dynamics. But because it was effective, it just became part of the way we do things. And eventually that's going to happen with ChatGPT as it plays out. It's going to become part of the background of how we do things. And so for me, it's that disruption of how we've done things that is the most euphoric.
All right, Stacey.
I love how subversive Sid is. Well, I mean, think about the printing press. I'm sure people in the audience can imagine the time when the printing press first emerged, right? And how disruptive that technology was. I mean, compared to that, I think ChatGPT is a drop in the bucket, quite frankly. The ability to put words and literacy in front of masses is enormously, it was enormously disruptive. So yeah, I tend to be a little bit of a subversive myself. So I welcome any kind of change that I think has the potential to benefit us. The topic of integrity is really important though. And I think that word came up quite a bit earlier in the conversation. And I think many people in the audience are wondering how to use this technology and how to represent it, how to present it in class with integrity. So the way that I think of integrity is very much in terms of behavioral criteria. What are the things that people need to be doing if they're behaving with integrity and authenticity? Seligman and Peterson in 2004 suggest 3 different behavioral criteria. One is knowing what your values are in the first place, and then living consistently with those values. The second is a public justification of one's values. So saying, this is what my values are, even if those values might be unpopular at a given time. And think about how many historic speakers and leaders we've had who have done that, right? And then the third is considering others and living with care for others. And so it sort of balances both one's own values and needs with the care for others. That's how Seligman and Peterson define behaviorally integrity. And so when we're thinking about using any kind of technology in the classroom, I would advocate talking about what are the students' values? What are their frames of reference to begin with? And if we make that the center of the conversation, then introduce technology, it can be a much more enriching conversation. If we have a moral grounding to stand on to begin with, the students know what their frame of reference is in terms of how they're saying, is this useful? Is this good? Is this bad? To me, that's really the foundation that we have to start from when we're talking about any new technology.
Awesome. And so to, in some ways, respond to what both of you were saying, Sid, I really like the idea that a disruptor ideally makes us better at what we do because it enables us to see things from a different perspective. And in the context of academic work, and for college students. This moment of ChatGPT potentially exposes some problems that there have been with the institutionalization of academic work, so that if you are in, a number of people have already done this on social media, asked ChatGPT what are best practices for assigning student writing given the concern about academic integrity with artificial intelligence. And it comes back with things that the three of us have been talking about for decades. Ask students to write in drafts, ask them to write in response to specific immediate context, ask them to generally interrogate and creatively problem solve through their writing as opposed to recapitulating information, right? And so those practices, in many ways, one I would argue should have already been in place. And this threat to the academic integrity hopefully points us in the direction of doing a better job of using those kinds of practices. It also, in my view, and it's interesting how we all see these things from kind of our own lenses. In my view, we have needed to talk about all kinds of related literacies. Media literacy and certainly information literacy has never been more important than at this moment. Trying to trace or connect who said what and what is the basis for their claims and their writing is something that now, if you're teaching any subject, and if you're teaching about knowledge production, if you're teaching about writing, we need to have an increasingly microscopic look at that. And that's something that lots of us have been doing already. But I like the idea that it creates more immediate teachable moments on the subject of writing practice and on integrity in the knowledge work we do. So now let's look at potentially the vertigo, the challenges and the deep concerns that might be represented in this moment in the advent of ChatGPT. Sid?
Can I jump in, Sid?
Please.
This is an amusing anecdote. I think Sid and Todd know a little bit about this because we were chatting about it offline a couple of days ago. So a few days ago, I was playing around with my wife in the kitchen, and I said, well, I'm going to type in write a love letter to Susan in ChatGPT, right? Speaking of vertigo, right? So I actually had ChatGPT write a love letter in her presence as I entered this thing. And then the interesting point of vertigo began when I actually started reading the letter very sincerely and authentically to her, almost like an actor performing it. And there were very real, I'm sure, chemical reactions happening inside of her. Oxytocin levels rising, cortisol levels, adrenaline levels decreasing, right? And yet she was kind of amused too. It was kind of an absurd moment as she said things like, oh, thank you, ChatGPT. As I'm reading this letter to her. I don't know. It's interesting. I got to thinking about, well, where do we draw the line with this? What if a stand-up comic starts using ChatGPT to write jokes in the style of Jerry Seinfeld or something like that? They still have to get up and perform it. And as we all know, stand-up comedy hangs on whether you can actually deliver those lines well or not, right? So I don't know. I think I think again, I would come back to what is the moral lens that we're looking at this from? And I think for most people, they're probably looking at this from a categorical moral reasoning perspective. If they're critical of it, they're looking at it from a Kantian point of view, saying, this is just categorically wrong if someone is representing themselves by using ChatGPT. That's a categorical moral reasoning perspective, right? They're saying that that's just false representation. But it's not a consequentialist moral reasoning perspective. And there's a couple of questions in the chat about neurodiversity, right? And how we can use this to serve the greater good, perhaps, is kind of where I'm going with it next. If it leads to better communication, if it leads to better social connection with others, is that serving a consequentialist, utilitarian moral ground, right, for trying to improve social relationships with others? So I would just put it out there. we have to decide what is our moral framework going to be when we're interpreting this. For many of us, we might look at this and say, well, if a student is saying type an essay on gun control or something like that, and then they turn that in, we'd say, well, that's categorically wrong, right? They're misrepresenting themselves. They didn't write the paper, right? That's a categorical critique of the technology. And I think most people would tend to agree with that. At the risk of getting a little bit too philosophical, I would push even on that and say, aren't we all sort of programmed by society? Aren't we all programmed by social interactions to say what we should say, to say what others want us to hear? How are we any different than that technology, other than we have awareness of our own thoughts? We have awareness of our own being, of our own mortality, right?
Yeah. Well, and you talk about the anecdote with reading the love letter, and my first response was, well, ChatGPT can't read that letter, can't deliver those lines the way that Stacey would to Susan, right? But then I think, in 5 years it probably could. It might be able to learn how to do that pretty well. Sid,
Yeah, I'm actually
here.
Yeah, I want to respond directly to Stacey, and I see that Susan's online too. So hi, Susan. But I was responding to one of the questions in the question and answer thing, and about is there a concern for whether ChatGPT makes the careers of freelance copywriters, proofreaders, and editors obsolete? I think that this is one of the interesting sort of negative questions that Todd's getting at long term about how do we think about what's wrong here. And I want to come back to what Stacey said in a second, but that notion of obsolescence is a value statement. And what we have to recognize is that ChatGPT and the other generative AIs, it's not that they're going to make things obsolete, it's they're going to change what jobs are. It's going to change how we do particular jobs. Yeah, I was writing in the response, I've been talking to a lot of media firms and a lot of PR firms about how ChatGPT is changing what they do. And particularly because I like to think about writing instruction, how it's going to aid my students beyond the classroom, what it's going to do in their civic lives, in their personal lives, and in their professional lives. And I was talking with a friend who works for a very large PR firm, and she said that they had recently fired 12 writers because for the cost of 12 writers, they can hire one AI expert, and the AI expert can turn out 300 articles a week, whereas the writers are turning out 1 or 2 a month. So that to me was a big cue of thinking about, well, how am I going to prepare my writing students to think about what their role as writers is going to be in their professional lives? But we've seen these same kinds of changes in writing, teaching, for a long time. Remember, and I'm sorry to bring this up, but I use it as an example, and the example has been absolutely destroyed this week by Scott Adams' racial rant. But Dilbert had a main character that was a technical writer that vanished because technical writers vanished because the role of technology changed who's supposed to write in the job, and we're all supposed to write in the job rather than the designated writer. Well, ChatGPT is going to change what we do at the job also. Do we have a designated writer, or are we using AI to generate content? So, there's a lot to unpack with that. But I want to go back to the point Stacey's making about, finding that moral ground on which to stand with this. Part of what we have to recognize also in terms of the larger concept of technology, particularly digital technology, is it always is already forcing us to rethink what those moral foundations are for us. We have, particularly over the last 10, 20 years, we have had to completely reconceptualize things like privacy, like observation, like security. These are all terms that we have had to drastically change what we understand them to mean. And, where we stood on privacy 15 years ago is a very different thing than where we stand on privacy now. And so while I completely agree, particularly from that rhetorical standpoint from Plato about writing, that, good men writing well, this requires that ethic of we need to teach our students how to use this stuff in ethical, moral approaches. But those things are going to change as this changes as well. So it's something that we've got to dig at quite a bit.
Absolutely.
Can I jump in, Todd?
Sure, go ahead.
And ask a question, Sid. So given the governor's stance in the state of Florida, talking about values, talking about identities, I mean, he's essentially legislating the discussion of these kinds of things should be banned. So how do we as as servants of the public good at public universities, respond to that sort of political pressure?
Wow, you're putting me on a public spot here to say that what I'm telling my, as a chair of a department, what I'm right now telling my faculty is to teach what you teach. We're not going to change that. The law changes in the next couple of weeks, then I wait for upper administration. But, I think I've made my disruptive MO kind of clear already. So I'm going to be reactive to it and tell my faculty, just, teach what you need to teach.
And so, it's interesting to me. I mean, and we've talked in the past about the difference between something that's just a tool that's sort of mechanical, like a spoon or a hammer, that doesn't really epistemologically change the way you see the world, compared to an electron microscope or medical imaging technology through which you see the world differently and think. And I would put this clearly in the epistemological category, in terms of an instrument through which you can see the world differently, and the world will be subsequently redetermined and reshaped. And so, it's interesting that Stacey has this moral lens. Sid tends to look at this from a sort of a philosophy and history of technology. I tend to look at these things very much from a pedagogical standpoint, in terms of like writing program administration. And one of the chief concerns I have right now, especially at the intersection of technology and education, is access and power and control. And the digital divide, as these technologies continue to accelerate, it seems to me that the digital divide between the haves and have-nots, the people who, in crude Marxist terms, can control the means of production, and those who cannot, continues to widen. And to me, this is another one of these moments where that gulf threatens to get even wider. And that article from Kissinger et al. Points to that. It's like one of the foundational characteristics about this is it's a kind of a Pandora's box, that you may develop this technology with the best intentions in the world, such as helping folks with different neurological experiences. But once you open the box and it starts sort of self-perpetuating, where does this end up? And I guess in writ large, that's my biggest concern. I think for the teaching of writing, we will come to terms very quickly with best practices for teaching and working with our instructor, with our students, to make these teachable moments. It's the potential rise of the machines, and these becoming a self-perpetuating entity that's controlled by some mysterious people writing the algorithms, that gets to be a concern. And so, Sid, you and I were talking the other day. We were talking about right-wing conservatives who are criticizing these technologies because they have programmed into the algorithms biases. And I was thinking about, searches I was doing the other day, and in some of the video and the image generating AI technologies, where, if I type in certain terms, I'm more likely to see men come up, and I'm more likely to see white people come up. And so, who is programming the algorithms, and who is putting the guardrails on these technologies, and who makes those decisions and controls them, is of great concern, because it isn't transparent. In fact, maybe it's too transparent, in that we don't have a sense of those people at all. And so, Sid, let's talk a minute about those inherent biases and biases for language and style and all kinds of things that may be potentially built into the evolution of AI.
Yeah, I think the starting point with that conversation is to recognize that even though we're thinking about AI as self-generating, that the machine learning algorithms are the AI teaching itself, we have to realize is that the initiating algorithms are human written. And so whatever we're writing the algorithm to do, that objective is already inherently human biased. And this is going back to the initial question of how does technology change how we're thinking about writing. We have to remember that coding is a form of writing, and that when we're coding something, that when we're writing something, that we are, and we can make this an easy, or going back to George Orwell, and say, everything we write is inherently political. And so when we're making word choices, when we're making sentence structure, we're creating a particular bias inherently. Writing is never apolitical. And so writing an algorithm is also never apolitical. On the surface, it may seem like a very basic, I'm going to go back to when I used to teach basic coding, but a very basic if-then statement, even that is setting a value of whether, line A or line B has a greater value, and what then gets done by that value in the algorithm. And so, we have to remember that while we have these sort of fears, which, by the way, most of our fears about AI are generated by artists in books and movies, rather than by coders who are actually doing the coding, that a lot of those fears are based on the idea that the AI is writing the AI. And, that's not the case. So.
All right. So
Todd, can I jump in? Because I see that Susan Miller Cochran was asking a question a moment ago about the obsolescence of the writing jobs and things like that. And I want to, if I can find her question, because I think it's worth addressing real fast.
Well,
go ahead. Sorry, Todd.
Sure. If we look at the number of jobs it took to produce a technical or professional document in the 90s, it took a team of people, including designers and printers and all that, and that has converged. And so what I think we've already said earlier is that maybe there won't be as many people with that job title, but there will be more people who are in charge with, let's call it whatever you want to call it, digital storytelling, communicating digitally. And so the way I see it is now everyone potentially in any career path may need to do what everyone needs to do, which is search or study galaxies of information, data, evidence, research, and writing, using tools like search engines and AI technologies to then come up with a perspective or an approach to creatively solving a problem that is often communicated through writing, right? So maybe the literal job titles aren't as prevalent as they used to be, but the need to tell a story, if you will, about data, information, and evidence has never been more important across all disciplines. So that's my perspective on that. All right, so let's zoom out a little. Let's leave writing a little bit to the side for the moment, and let's think about creativity. Stacey, you're a creative writer, fiction writer, a published novelist, now also a filmmaker. Sid, I know you've been doing illustrations for a long time, and you do a lot of creative work with digital media content, as I do. What do we think about the future of creativity? Are we going to allow these technologies to be creative for us so we don't have to? Is this going to enhance technology creativity in some ways? Obviously, we'll probably get to the conclusion that creativity is going to evolve. But it's one of the things that we consider to be sort of essentially human. That is, being creative is what separates us, in some people's perspective, from other forms of life, that we have that potential to create. And so what are your instincts? I want to begin with you, Stacey, about the perspectives on the future of creativity, and maybe also the teaching of creativity in college.
Well, it's a great question. This might seem like a bit of a defense to trying to answer that question, but I would just put out there that we all operate with our own frames of reference about even what creativity means. Right. So my kids growing up now, I have an 11-year-old, a 16-year-old, their frame of reference is going to be informed by the sociocultural environments that they're living in. The three of us are not 11 years old, right? We're informed by the frames of reference that we lived in. And each of us had unique frames of reference with which to process our world. So I'll just put that out there to begin with. Any kind of conversation where I'm starting to put forward an opinion about the potential impacts on creativity are based on my own lived experiences, which are limited. So I'm going to put that disclaimer out there to start with. That said, the frame of reference that I come from is to embrace technology. The very earliest memory that I have, like when I was probably 3 years old, the earliest memory I have is actually of watching a movie of Star Wars at a drive-in movie theater. Like that's the earliest childhood memory I have, is of the use of technology and bringing a family together and a community together. And so my entire life has been informed by emerging technology that can bring communities together, right? So there's a great series called The Journey Through American Cinema by Martin Scorsese. It was funded by the BBC, and this was done in the mid-90s. Maybe you've seen it, I don't know. Maybe some folks in the audience have seen it. Look it up if you've not. It's a great, great history of American cinema as seen through the eyes of Martin Scorsese. And about midway through this series, he interviews George Lucas, he interviews Francis Ford Coppola, and he asked a very question that was, I think, on the minds of filmmakers in the 90s, which was, if we're using computer-generated characters, for example, imagine a legion of stormtroopers, and they only started with like 16 stormtroopers, but in the shot that the audience sees, there's hundreds or thousands of them. Is that somehow cheating, right? And there was a quote that I think it was George Lucas. It might have been Francis Ford Coppola who said this, but it's in that series, Journey Through American Cinema, where he said, well, creativity is never, the technology is never the source of the creativity. It is just a tool to enact the source of the creativity. So at least at this point in human history, the source of creativity is always human. So if I'm creating an image using Midjourney or some sort of software like that, or some technology that Adobe creates, right? The source of the creativity is me. I'm creating. I have the impulse to want to create this flyer or this poster or this video. The technology is just a vehicle. It's a tool to get me to an image that's somewhat hazy in my mind that I'm trying to create, right? The interesting question with this technology is, and I think the question that maybe we need to tackle in this conversation or later conversations is it possible for the technology to become self-aware in the way that if I'm doing a meditation and I'm thinking about my own thoughts, I can be aware of my own thoughts, and then I can alter those thoughts to achieve an optimal outcome? Can a computer potentially do that? And if it can, sort of James Cameron Terminator style, it raise a lot of interesting questions.
Absolutely.
I love that. I love that thread about AI self-awareness. You know, Skynet now has been AI aware for quite a while. I forget the exact date, but it was sometime in the 1980s. But the thing about self-awareness is, and I've talked to a lot of people who are in hardware aspects of computer sciences, we are nowhere near being able to make the actual hardware that would facilitate something like that. We don't, there's actually pragmatic issues with that happening. So I love the sort of theoretical question of what happens, but that question really is something we take up in post-humanities already, in asking about agency of non-human others in all sorts of other forms as well. And that has become a conversation that is taken up in legislative policy around the world right now. What animals do we grant intelligence? What animals do, you know, so this is just adding another question of what happens if we build the intelligence. But right now, we don't have the tools to do it anyway.
And so your perspective on this question is, AI really isn't creative in a human sense at this moment. Do you agree with that or no?
Me or Stacey?
You.
Oh, no, I don't think AI is creative at all. AI is, you know, taking what's already out there, remolding it. I mean, it's more, I think it's doing a task, but I don't think that task has its own creativity yet. I think Stacey's right that, I mean, unless we want to make an analog between the machine learning's concept of life, of, you know, its life experiences as somehow being the equivalent of what Stacey's describing as life experiences. But, you know, all it's doing is gathering data. I don't see that as inherently creative. I mean, I agree completely with Stacey that what it is a tool that you can use to do creative things with. and it may change how we do things, but I don't think the AI itself is creative. I mean, look for instance at Jasper, or look at, or Dolly, these image generators, that are turning out some remarkable images, but they're not creative in the way that, Stacey was talking about creativity. They're almost objectively produced.
Right. And so you mentioned Dali, and in where I grew up in Tampa, there was the Salvador Dali Museum across the bay in St. Petersburg that I went to all the time. And so years later, when I started studying film, I saw Salvador Dali in Brunel's film, very famous film with the slicing eyeball, Un Chien Andalou. And as I was studying that, it occurred to me what they were doing in the late 20s and early 30s was they were taking what was a new technology available to them, motion pictures, and they're saying, what would a painter do with this new technology? And then, experimenting with all kinds of things which were absolutely eccentric at the time, but now have become commonplace. And so that's my personal view in terms of creativity at this moment with these technologies where they are. I don't see us getting to that somewhat sentient point where you could say that these technologies are really conversing with humans, or really having or creating something from nothing in that sense. And so my feeling is that what artists were going to be doing is picking up this new technology and seeing what it enables, what it disrupts, how they can advance creativity in their particular art forms with it. My biggest concern is who's controlling these things, because they are going to have significant biases, and who has access and who doesn't. So as we turn from these more sort of philosophical overviews to closing practical matters, I'm going to put one more poll in the chat and ask, which sort of gets at this question of, like, to what extent might it be our responsibility to teach creativity now that it's potentially coming into question and into challenge? And I'll begin with my sort of quick view of leaving, what we should be leaving behind here in terms of a takeaway. And in my perspective is that you could go to ChatGPT and say, what are some best practices for teaching writing in a college setting in terms of academic integrity, given the use of gen tech in to produce writing, and you'll get lots of really great answers about that. So those more practical matters, we may want to touch on them in general, but to me the focal point is this, and this hasn't changed, that the real goal as a new technology like this, impactful technology like this emerges, is for all of our students to become critical, responsible, ethical users of constantly emerging technologies. And that's very difficult to do. I think we can all agree on that goal. We want them to have critical capacities on this. We want them to we want them to be lifelong learners and constantly adapting to new technologies that haven't even hit the mainstream yet, right? So to me, it isn't even so much that outcome or that goal. It's the method by which the curriculum and our pedagogies try to achieve that goal. And from my perspective, in order to achieve that goal, students must have constant, varied experiences where they learn by doing, by making, by composing, by designing, sharing, producing, and writing, and when I say writing writ large, with these transformative technologies and instruments to solve immediate problems creatively. So in other words, they need to be like Salvador Dali and Brunel. They need to pick up this thing and start playing with it to solve immediate problems in real world contexts right in front of them. But they need lots of those experiences. And in fact, they need it across the curriculum, in every discipline, in every opportunity, in order for them to come to terms with this, but more importantly, help them to develop the agility to constantly have further critical perspectives on additional technologies as they emerge. And so that, to me, is my sort of one takeaway in terms of what I consider to be best practice. Stacey, do you have any sort of practical, specific recommendations for how we can come to terms with this in the context of college writing.
Yeah, I go back to what I said at the beginning of the conversation. I think as we're thinking about using any new technology, it is so important to help students understand the frame of reference, and specifically the moral frame of reference that they're making their judgments with. If we're looking at this from a Kantian sort of categorical moral reasoning perspective, misrepresenting one's work, I think most of us would universally say there's something just universally wrong about that. Right? If we're looking at it from, a Bentham utilitarian consequentialist moral reasoning perspective, and we're saying, well, how does this technology serve the greatest good? Then we can look at it and say, well, this is helping students to think about answers to questions, maybe think about how they would even ask a question, pose a question. And so I would start with a foundation of what is the moral lens that we're even thinking about analyzing that very question from, of using this type of technology or any technology that's going to emerge. There was a really interesting question from the chat by Anuj Gupta, a graduate student here at the University of Arizona, about where is the research going to go in the future with this? And Sid, I hope you're right, I think, but I need to evaluate my statement about that maybe this is a long way off, this idea of a technology being self-aware. I don't know how far off it really is. Now, again, my frame of reference is that I've grown up in a world of movies that does sort of misrepresent perhaps that emerging technology. But think about how many technologies seemed like science fiction just 50 or 60 years ago that are our reality today. This very call. We can all remember the video call in 2001, right? With the guy calling back to his daughter from a spaceship. And we're like, a video call? That would be awesome. Well, look where we're at now. So I think a lot of folks who know my work know that I'm really interested in supporting well-being. So any emerging technology, I would be directing towards how can we use that technology to support our well-being, to support our being well, psychologically, socially, financially, spiritually, all of it, right? So I think that's the area to move forward with, is to see how can we use this technology to enhance our social connections with others, to improve our social communications. What are some of the drawbacks potentially? And I think misrepresenting one's own work is one of the big ones with this kind of technology. It's just so super easy to say, I wrote this thing, I'll post it on Facebook or whatever and see if people will respond to it. So we have to tackle that misrepresentation, I think, head on.
Sid, you get the last word. 2 minutes. Oh wow, there's so much there. I want to go back to Anuj's comment too, but there's so much that we need to be thinking about with all this stuff right now, and this notion that Stacey brings up about misrepresenting our writing as our own and those sort. I think that's very contextual too, right? Right now we look at what ChatGPT does, and we talk about it as it produces writing that's good enough. And in some situations, writing that is good enough is good enough. So for instance, let's say hypothetically, I work in a business that produces a very large catalog of products. Nobody who reads a catalog ever worries about, is this represented accurately as the writer? So why not have ChatGPT produce your content for a catalog? We tend to forget, because we're in the academic world where our writing is we're assessing writing as reflection of knowledge of our students, where we're teaching writing for civic and personal and all, but most of the writing that's produced in the world isn't read. It's produced for some very specific contextual kinds of documents. And so, yeah, we need to rethink that concept of representation and plagiarism and all those kinds of things and how we're using it. But most of the writing that our students do once they leave our classrooms has nothing to do with them as human beings. It has to do with content dispersion across an industry. And for me, good. Now let's teach them how to use those tools to get those jobs, to do those jobs better. So I think that there are various areas of how we're sort of oversimplifying what writing is here and what the purpose of writing is in different contexts. So I don't disagree with Stacey at all, but at the same time, there are a lot of contexts where that's just kind of irrelevant in terms of whether or not it's an authentic writer or not.
We're at the top of the hour. You guys have been fantastic. This is version 1.0. This is a long conversation. I've just released the results of the second poll. Like the previous one, equal distribution. Everyone is going to be working together on these issues, and we thank you so much for everyone who tuned in today to listen to us. We will be reaching out to you through email, so please check your spam filters for this continuing conversation. Thank you, Stacey. Thank you, Sid, so much for helping us orient amidst the vertigo and euphoria. Until next time, I'm Todd Taylor. This is the Adobe Digital Literacy Cafe. Thanks, everyone, for being with us today. Bye, everyone. We will do our best in the email follow-up to answer some of those questions in the chat pod. If you wanted to take on one or two of them in particular yourself, I'll send you something. You're under no obligation to do that. But if you did in the write-up want to respond to one or two of those things, I want to be sure to give you the opportunity to do that if you want to. And thanks again for being here.
I've been trying to respond as rapidly as I can to a bunch of them. So
yeah,
I do one point of clarification, Todd. When I brought up Dolly, I wasn't bringing up Dolly as in Salvador, but the AI. You okay? So DALLE. Yeah. Okay, gotcha. So
sure.
All right.
All right, thanks. And Dolly too.
Dolly too. Yep, it's actually open on my desktop right now.
Stacey, any hanging threads for you?
Not really. I'm just glad I was able to be a little bit coherent here this morning.
We were fantastic, man.
We had a fun night last night with a dog having a bit of an accident in the middle of the night. So,
I'm sorry. Hope things are better today. Hey, good morning, Susan.
Hey, Hey there, Susan.
We'll stop the recording.